Hello everyone. Welcome. This is the very large meeting and writing workshop, the first of 2 breakout sessions this afternoon. This is with Dr Kira-Anne Pelican, who is here. If you could just give us a wave. Here on the top of your screens. Shortly, I will be spotlighting Kira-Anne so that she is the only face you will see on screen. But because this is a writing workshop, we wanted it to feel a little more interactive than the seminars in the morning. We've made this a meeting, but we are just kindly asking you to keep yourselves on mute until such point as there might be questions or interaction while you're doing particular exercises. This is quite a packed writing workshop, so I'm going to keep this introduction extremely brief. And only just to say welcome, thank you for being here. Please use the chat if you have any issues, any questions. If at any time you need to take a break, absolutely fine. If you want to switch off your video, walk around, also absolutely fine. I'm going to now spotlight your tutor. So she should be the only face that you're seeing on screen. And I'm going to hand over to Dr. Kira-Anne Pelican for the science of writing characters.
Thank you very much. First of all, it's absolutely lovely to be here, a huge honour, and I'm delighted to meet all of you. I'm going to be going through this quite fast, but as it's recorded, I'm hoping that even if there are some things that I go through quite rapidly in this session, you'll be able to come back to them in the recording if you need to. So I'm going to just share my screen, and I've got some PowerPoint that I'm going to share with you now. Here we go. And right, so I'm going to be talking about the science of writing characters. So my background is that I have a psychology degree. I've worked in the film and television industry for a while, and I now teach screenwriting. And for my PhD, I was really interested in what we can learn from psychology to help us as writers create more compelling characters. So first of all, my first question was, when I was looking at this, was really what makes a great character, and is there any consensus at all around who those great characters are? So if it was that, everybody that I asked, all the public and different critics had all individually different ideas about who the great characters are and what makes a great character, then of course there's really nothing that we can learn from that. But I had a feeling that there probably were quite a few things
Sorry, I'm very sorry to interrupt you, Kira-Anne. We have a couple of people saying they can't really hear you very well. My sound is quite good, so please do turn your volumes up. But if there's any way you can speak just a little closer to the microphone, and I do apologise, that sound is my dog. I'm going on mute now.
No problem. So I hope that you can now hear a bit better. Coming back to the consensus, is there any consensus around what makes a great character? When we start to look at this, we find that on list after list made by critics, lists of award-winning characters in novels, and public polls of who are the greatest characters, we tend to find many of the same characters named again. Some of them, just a few of them are on here from film, TV, novels, and so on. So what do they have in common? Well, I think that what they have in common is, first of all, they are believable. I'm clearly not the first person to say this. They're believable, they're complex and mostly consistent. And I'm going to be talking about what I mean by that shortly. They're also surprising in believable ways, as Ian Forster has said. They are, of course, emotionally engaging. We engage through our stories emotionally, so they must be emotionally engaging to pull us in. They're memorable, and I'm going to be talking about what we can learn from psychology, personality psychology, to better understand what memorable means. They're, of course, motivated, you know all about that, and typically they're given the possibility of transformation. So not all characters transform, but in the vast majority of our stories, because transformation and change is very important to us. As we've evolved, we have pressures on us, and we have to be able to change to accommodate those pressures in order to survive. We can feel that really now in the pandemic. So something very important in our stories, they're given the possibility of transformation. So I want to come back to Ian Forster. Ian Forster certainly seems to be one of the first people in the West to have noticed the difference between, observed the difference between rounded and flat characters. He made the point, writing in aspects of the novel, that the central characters in novels are believable because they're complex, they feel real, they are rounded. They also typically transform, and they continue as we continue turning the pages of the novel. They continue to surprise us, but in believable ways. It was Forster that made that observation. So I'll come back to what I think that means shortly. He also noted that there is lots of space for flat characters. Flat characters are very, very important as supporting characters as well. They mustn't distract us from the story. We get to know them just on a few personality dimensions or traits. So as we meet them again and again, they may be, for example, witty and outgoing or a bit neurotic. And there are certain things that we recognise in them every time we meet them. And that's enough for the time that we spend with them in the novel for them to feel completely believable. We don't spend long enough with them for them to need any more depth than that. And that's appropriate, and it doesn't distract us from the main storyline. Okay, so I'm going to come back to what does complexity mean in a character, but this is a workshop. So first of all, what I'd love you to do is to think about the character you're currently working on and try and jot down around about 10, if you can get to that point, adjectives just describing your character's psychology. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes. That's not very long. I apologise. So really any descriptive words here at all would be useful as long as they're not describing your character physically. If they're chatty, if they're a warrior, anything like that is useful. And I appreciate that if you haven't been spending too long with the character you're currently working on, this is possibly quite a hard exercise for you. Just going to give you one more minute. Okay, I'm sorry that's such a rush. You'll be able to return to this afterwards if you need to. What I'd love you to do now is to look at that list, however many words you've come up with, and to try and group together any words there, any adjectives that seem similar. So, or that you feel could go together. So, for example, chatty and outgoing feel as though they may go together. Okay, and I'm wondering how many groups you've got. So typically, I'm not going to be able to get you all to vote on this, but typically I find that some people have 3, 4, 5, and even up to 6. That's the typical range that I see here. And I'm going to show you shortly why I'm getting you to look at this, because arguably if you've got less than 5, that it may be that at this particular point, either I haven't given you long enough, or it may be that there's an aspect of your character psychology that you're missing. Okay, so let's take a look at why I'm asking you to do this exercise. So back in Virginia in the States in the 1950s, 2 military psychologists were given the task of trying to predict which candidates for pilot training school were likely to make the best pilots, okay? And they hypothesized that those pilot candidates, or the best pilots, would have something psychologically in common. So that to us may feel fairly obvious now, but back in those days, personality psychology was very much in its infancy. And so what they went ahead and did is they had the hypothesis that to completely capture and understand somebody's personality, we must use, if we take all the words in the English language that describe somebody's character or personality, that must describe them in full. In other words, for every important thing that we notice about somebody else's personality, we must have a word for it. If it's not important to us, we won't have a word for it. So to fully understand personality, we have to take every word of the English language and start to work out whether we can group these together, whether there are synonyms, whether we need all of those words. So using the process of this lexical hypothesis, personality testing on those pilots, and factor analysis to get these groups of words, they found out that there are 5 dimensions of personality. Okay, so they discovered that personality can be described by 5 dimensions, and that this was an incredibly robust finding. So these personality dimensions predict that the way someone acts, interacts with others, even the way that we experience the world emotionally. They predict our motivations, the way that we feel about things in the world, our beliefs, even the way that we speak. So they're very powerful, and the personality is very much at the core of character. So what are these big 5 dimensions of personality that they later renamed these big 5? Okay, they are extroversion versus introversion, agreeableness versus disagreeableness, neuroticism versus emotional stability, conscientiousness versus lack of conscientiousness, openness to experience versus being closed to experience. So the argument here is that if we really want to describe a complex character, we need to capture them on all 5 dimensions. So not every character, but your main characters that we spend time with. Each of these personality dimensions is a spectrum or sliding scale. So somebody can be very extroverted, moderately extroverted, or highly introverted. Each one is a sliding scale. They're not dichotomies. And each of these is independent. So the degree to which you or any one of your characters is highly extroverted has absolutely no bearing on the degree to which they are disagreeable or neurotic. Okay, they're completely and utterly independent. Right, even going a bit further than that, if we think about these personality dimensions, most people aren't highly extroverted or highly introverted or highly conscientious or highly unconscientious. They're somewhere in the middle. So they're distributed normally in a population. So most of us and most of the people that we meet will be roughly in the middle, in that hump of that curve, okay, between those 2 lines. So if most people are like that, what does that mean for the more memorable people or characters? So rather than getting you to shout out because it's a bigger group, it means that they're likely to be the outliers. They're going to sit on the end. So on at least a couple of dimensions, it's likely that the more memorable characters are going to rate more strongly. They're going to be more introverted, more extroverted, more disagreeable. Those are the people that are different from the ones that we meet every day in our lives, and they're therefore more memorable, the outliers. Okay, so at least a couple of dimensions. So if you get the note when you've written your novel that your main character is interesting, fairly believable, but not that memorable, this may be something to think about when you're addressing that note. Going further than that, every one of those personality, those 5 personality dimensions, is associated with different personality traits. So they can be further broken down into 6 facets or subtraits. I'm going to explain what I mean. This is abstract theory at the moment, but I'll show you exactly what I mean in a moment. And we can use those to create further character complexity and nuance. Okay, so what are these big 5 dimensions I've been talking about? So first of all, let's start with extroversion versus introversion. So you don't need me to tell you that this is one of the first things that we see in other people when we meet them. We're very, very quickly aware of whether somebody's more of an extrovert or more of an introvert, or whether they're somewhere in the middle. So extroverts, really, they thrive on attention. They literally grab our attention and compel us to watch. So they thrive and gain energy from their social interactions. The more they socialise and meet people and go out and go to parties, the more animated and energetic they are. They love this. Introverts, on the other hand, they tend to be much quieter, more reflective people. They gain their energy from having quiet time to themselves. They have far fewer but deeper relationships with just a few people that are important to them. They have, whether that's friends or family. They also tend to be more serious than extroverts, who tend to be more playful and upbeat. Okay, so looking further into that, these are the facets associated with extroversion. Extroverts are typically warm, gregarious, assertive. I now need to move this over here so it's out of the way of my screen. Warm, gregarious, assertive, active. They tend to love excitement and they have more positive or upbeat emotions. But to be an extrovert, you just need to be higher in at least 3 of these. So not all extroverts are high in every one of these. They're not all very warm, very gregarious, very assertive, very active, love excitement, have positive emotions. They are high in just at least 3 of these. So what becomes interesting is when we create characters that are high in some of these facets and low in others. And this is the nuance and complexity we can start creating with characters. So I'm going to start getting you to think about this in relation to your characters now. Oh, go back. So first of all, I'm going through each of these in turn. Is your character generally warm towards other people, and do they find it easy to make new friends? Okay, so this is the first dimension related to extroversion. Or on the other hand, are they more formal, reserved, or aloof with others? I'm going to go through these quite fast. I'm sorry about the speed. Okay, are they assertive? Generally, so think about your character at the beginning of your story when they're most authentic to themselves, when they're most relaxed and most authentic to themselves. I'm going to be talking later about how we change in different situations. You're absolutely right if you're already thinking about that. So if they're not assertive, do they often feel inferior to others? Are they active? So obviously for some genre stories, it's essential that your character's full of energy. That drives the narrative. But we can equally make interesting stories about characters that are inhibited. Does your character crave excitement and enjoy noisy places, meeting new people and starting new relationships? Do they love excitement? Or on the other hand, do they prefer the quiet life? Do they have positive emotions? Are they generally playful and exuberant? Not necessarily all the time, but when they're at the most themselves, when they're most relaxed. Are they upbeat? This, of course, has a huge impact on the tone of the story that you're writing. Your main character is very playful. Or on the other hand, is your main character serious? Okay, I'm going to move on to the next dimension now. As I'm asking you these questions, you may be thinking, yes, they're definitely this, they're definitely not that. I'm not sure about this one. So what we take away when we read characters, or even when we see them on screen, are the traits and the dimensions that they score most extremely on. So if they're moderate, they're neither this nor this. We don't generally even have words for that. Okay, they're somewhere in between, you don't notice it. So don't worry about the ones where they're somewhere in the middle. That's not important for your character. The ones that your reader will perceive are the ones that they express most strongly. So the next dimension, agreeableness versus disagreeableness, is the degree to which we cooperate with others, the degree to which we care about others. People who are highly agreeable are very caring, they make lovely friends, they're typically warm, friendly and cooperative. People who are disagreeable are the strong characters. Sometimes they're often the antagonistic characters, but actually they're also the strong opinionated characters. And if they're driven by good, there are traits relating to a disagreeableness that we can find very appealing in characters as well. So disagreeableness related to strength of character and being argumentative and difficult. Going to that a bit further, characters who are very agreeable have all these lovely traits that we like in others. They're trusting, they're straightforward, they're altruistic, they're compliant, they cooperate with others, they're modest and they're tender-minded or caring, okay? So these are qualities that we like in others. As I said before, if your character's agreeable, it just means that they are high in at least 3 of these, okay? They can also be low in others. They don't have to be high in every single one of these. In relation to your character, does your character believe in people's intrinsic goodness? Are they very trusting of others when they first meet them? Or are they suspicious of strangers? Are they straightforward? Really, that means, are they honest? Are they more likely to be frank and sincere? Not in a mean way, but are they just an honest person? As opposed to the opposite, disagreeable side is, do they use flattery, manipulation and deception to get their way with others, which obviously can be an intriguing quality in people. Horrible, but intriguing. Okay, does your character go out of their way to help others? Are they altruistic? Or are they self-centered? Is your character compliant? Do they tend to defer to others? Or do they prefer to compete rather than cooperate? Are they modest? Are they humble? Are they self-effacing? Or on the other hand, are they arrogant? Are they tender-minded? Are they moved by others' needs? Are they caring? Okay. Or does your character feel very little sympathy towards others? Okay. So if it feels like I'm going super fast here, just please remember you've got the recording. You can always go back to this, and I'm going to come back to questions at the end. So the next dimension is all about the way that we experience the world emotionally. Some people and studies show that writers are more likely to experience and feel the world deeply. So we're more sensitive. That means we're more prone to ups and downs and anxiety and having lows and feeling more vulnerable. So all of those qualities are obviously wonderful for writers, and then they're wonderful for characters at the heart of stories that are very internal. They're about internal conflict, our internal drives. On the other end of the spectrum, we have very emotionally stable characters. Emotionally stable characters they're much more resilient, they're much calmer, and they are fabulous for stories where the conflict isn't internal, it's external. So if you take an emotionally stable character, they're perfect for going out on adventures and dealing with those. They're not going to be consumed by the anxieties they have within. So this is really another really interesting dimension, I think, to think about in relation to your characters and genre. Okay, so the facets of neuroticism, the facets related to neuroticism are anxiety, anger, hostility, depression, feeling self-conscious, being impulsive, and feeling vulnerable. Again, as I've said before, your character doesn't have, if your character's more neurotic, it doesn't mean that they have to have all of these. You can pick and choose from this list. So let's go through those in turn. So first of all, is your character more of a warrior? Or are they mostly relaxed? Does your character often get angry about the way they're treated by others? Or are they easygoing and slow to anger? What about depression? Does your character often feel lonely or blue? And are they prone to feelings of guilt? These things often go together. Or do they rarely experience these feelings? Does your character feel uncomfortable and self-conscious around others? Or are they at ease in awkward social situations? Is your character impulsive? Do they often succumb to their impulses? So this is an interesting one because adventurous characters are often impulsive in a very healthy and useful way. So they're the people that will go and jump in the river to rescue the drowning child. But there are also disordered impulses, which can lead to addictions. So your character may have either. Or on the other hand, they may not be impulsive at all. They may be somebody who finds it very easy to resist temptation. Is your character someone who feels vulnerable? When they're under a lot of stress, do they sometimes feel as if they're going to pieces? So going back to those original pilots in that study, that's of course something that was very important that pilots don't do, and our action heroes and heroines don't do. But can be also fascinating for characters in dramas. Or does your character feel capable of handling difficult situations? Okay, so the next dimension is conscientiousness versus lack of conscientiousness. Characters who are very conscientious are very driven by a sense of responsibility and duty to others. They tend to be very goal-driven characters, and they're dutiful, they're responsible. They're responsible. On the other hand, we have characters who are unconscientious and they're irresponsible, more spontaneous, free and easygoing kind of characters. Okay, so conscientiousness is associated with being competent, feeling as though that you can take on different challenges and that that you have the abilities to get on with those. Being ordered or well organised, being dutiful, so feeling responsible. That could be towards work, that could be towards family, it could be towards both or one or the other. So it can also be contextual. They are typically high on achievement striving. That means they're goal driven. So not everybody is goal driven. They're typically self-disciplined and slower, deliberate thinkers rather than spontaneous. So if you think about this in relation to, for example, a detective in a story, one possibility is that you make the detective high on all of these. They're very competent. They're organised. They're dutiful at home and at work. They're very driven by their work and very responsible. Really want to catch the murderer. Very self-disciplined and slow, deliberate thinkers. But it's probably far more interesting if you start mixing those things up. So you've a character that's potentially really messy, feels competent, is maybe dutiful at work but not at home in relation to family responsibilities. So again, nuances come by creating characters that are high in some of these traits and lower in others. So thinking about this in relation to your main character, does your main character feel well prepared for life? Or do they often feel ill prepared and incompetent? Does your character have a clear set of goals and work towards them in an orderly fashion? Are they ordered, well organised? That also goes together with being tidy as well. Or on the other hand, do they find it hard to get organised? Okay, is your character reliable and dependable? Are they dutiful? And it could be interesting if that's contextual, if they're very reliable and dependable at work, not so at home, or the other way around. Or is your character unreliable? What about achievement striving? Does your character have high aspirations and work hard to achieve their goals? Are they very goal driven? For some stories, that's going to be essential. For others, it isn't. They may not be interested in personal success at all. Is your character self-disciplined? Do they try and complete all the tasks given to them? Do they set their own tasks and complete them themselves? And I apologise that I'm using a writer's photo here, that's just such a horrible cliche. Or does your character tend to procrastinate, get distracted, feel discouraged, and then quit? As of course we don't, as writers. Okay, does your character tend to think carefully before acting? Or are they more spontaneous? Okay, so if we had more time in this workshop, I would then get you to, with all of these, go back and reflect on which of those facets do we see most strongly. So we won't see necessarily all of them strongly, but which are the most important to your characters? Those, as I've said before, are the ones that we read and we take away. And I'm also aware that, as I said before, it may be that you have a really good idea of these because you're in a first or a second draft of your novels or your stories that you're writing, or it may be that if you've only just started them and you're working on a new character, that you need an awful lot more time to get these. Of course, the more time we spend with our characters, the more likely we're to get the answers. So the final dimension is one that I think is really interesting. So openness to experience versus being closed to experience. And this is all about the degree to which we are really open-minded and closed-minded. And of course, that's huge because that frames the way that we think about the world and our beliefs about the world and the things that we want to do. So people who are very open to experience, they love trying new things. They love learning new things. They love meeting new people. They really appreciate people's differences. They want to explore those differences in conversation. They love debate. They often are really interested in the arts and culture and aesthetics. So they value people's differences and they like trying new things. People who are more closed-minded tend to be much more grounded and traditional. They prefer the familiar, the everyday around them. So that's also, as you're probably starting to think, it's also moderately associated with political beliefs. People more open to experience tend to be more liberal. People more close to experience tend to be more conservative. Okay, so the more grounded, close to experience people prefer, as I said, the everyday and the familiar, and they tend to feel more threatened or uninterested in people with very different ideas and values to themselves. So, of course, what's fascinating about that, from a writer's perspective, or really interesting and useful, is that when you take characters that are open to experience and close to experience together, plenty of conflict. They just see the world in very different ways. So, facets of openness. So people who are higher on openness to experience are often dreamers. Not always, they don't have to have all of these qualities, but they're often dreamers. Um, so it may be that they're thinking about their novel most of the day. It may be that they're thinking about somewhere specific that they want to be, traveling to and being in a different country. They're not grounded in the way that people who are more closed to experience typically are. They are often interested in arts and culture and aesthetics. They value feelings and they like experiencing a range of feelings. That's something important to them. They love trying new things, engaging in different actions. They like learning. They like continuing to learn throughout their lives and finding, learning new ideas. And they're also interested in different values. So, first of all, what about your character? Does your character have a vivid imagination and enjoy daydreaming? It doesn't have to be this far-fetched. Or on the other hand, are they firmly grounded in reality and think that daydreaming is a complete waste of time? There are far too many practical things to get on with. Is your character deeply moved by art, music, and poetry? So it may be that your story doesn't touch any of these concerns, so we don't actually get to find out. But it's probably something useful for you to know as a writer. Or on the other hand, is your character more insensitive and unengaged by the arts? What about feelings? Does your character place high value on emotional experiences? That may be hugely important if you're writing something romantic or that has a love story in it. Or does your character experience more blunted emotions and place less value on feelings? I thought this was quite an interesting one. I didn't actually realise there was such a variation in the degree to which people place value on feelings before I started this research. What about actions? Does your character love travelling, trying new activities and experiences? Is that important to them? Or on the other hand, do they prefer familiarity and routine? Maybe they need to be forced on an adventure. What about ideas? Is your character open-minded? Do they love learning new things? Or are they unwilling or uninterested in new or unconventional ideas? And what about values? Is your character willing to re-examine social, political, or religious values? Or are they dogmatic, conservative, and traditional? Okay, so I've come to the end of that. I'm nearish the end. We've got another 5 minutes before I take questions, but I just want to touch on a few other things that may have already been occurring to you, and there may already be some questions about these. And that's the degree, that's backstory and context. So first of all, the degree to which, so we inherit we inherit roughly 50% of these traits or these dimensions. So about 50% of the degree to which we have these dimensions or traits comes from our parents and our grandparents. So that means we'd expect to find some similarity in our families, but also potentially some differences. Now, if we only inherit around about 50%, there's a variation per particular trait and per dimension. but it's roughly 50%. If we inherit only about 50%, it means that the rest is shaped by our backstory. So that's fascinating when we're thinking about character design in our stories. So that if you create a character, for example, that is, quite neurotic, quite angry, quite defensive, it means that the audience are probably, or the reader is probably starting to think about why are they like that. And when you go on to later reveal that they've had a difficult backstory or difficult things in their past they've gone through, emotionally intense experiences, difficult ones, that we'll start to understand why. So we love making those conclusions and drawing meaning from those findings in narrative. So I think this is something that's really interesting to think about when you're creating your characters. Why might they be like that? Because half of that is down to your explanation, your backstory that you're giving them. It also means if you're creating a family that we can create a lot of differences in the family, and that we'll start to attribute maybe the parents treated some, the kids in some way, or the carers treated some kids in some way, siblings in a different way. Maybe the other things happened specifically to some kids and didn't happen to others. Okay, so we start to wonder why. So I think that's interesting. Okay, personality shaped by genetics and backstory. Then our behaviour is also contextual. So something you might have been thinking, and I often get it if I spend a bit longer in these workshops, give you longer time. People ask questions, they say, well, my character behaves in different ways in different situations. Absolutely, we all behave in different ways in different situations. So extroverts, when they're in lockdown and they're at home, proper lockdown, and they're not allowed out at all, they're not going to be exuberant and chatty and upbeat and laughing at home by themselves. They're probably losing their energy. They don't have that opportunity to thrive and have those social interactions. So they may become quite depressed and act more as introverts. In the same way that if you take an introvert to a party, if they're painfully shy, they may stand there in the corner, then start to be aware of social expectations on them that they should be talking to others. Force themselves to start talking to somebody else if they don't spot their closest friend, start chatting, realise they're enjoying it, have a few drinks, and they're far more chatty than they normally would be. They act in a far more extroverted fashion than they normally would. So we all behave in a variety of different ways because our behaviour is shaped by our mood. If something bad's happened to us, we're likely to be in a grumpier mood or in a more, sadder mood, and the situation we're in. Typically, we behave in ways that we see as advantageous to the social situation we're in. If we take briefly the example of Lisbeth Salander from Girl with a Dragon Tattoo, she's introduced initially in the novels, in the film, as a quieter, more passive character who kind of gets on with her hacking and her job. When she is in a situation where she feels threatened by men, we see her acting not just aggressively, but pretty sadistically. And of course, that makes sense. She's trying to survive, but we also understand, we learn that she has had a very traumatic past. And it completely makes sense when we've learned that, that she now acts in this sort of out of character, counter-dispositional way when she's in these situations where she feels threatened by a man because of her backstory. So we're again reading meaning to it. So coming back to E.M. Forster saying that characters should continue to surprise us as we turn the pages of a novel in believable ways. I think this is an interesting thing to think about here. So how does your character surprise us? What do they do? What is it when they act out of character, completely out of character? What does that reveal about them? Okay, they're stripped down. What do we learn about their past, for example, when they act out of character? When they can't behave in ways that they would like to present themselves to the world, when they're under huge pressure. And if you show a character, and in order to make that believable, if you show a character repeatedly in those situations, acting in that same out of character way, we'll believe it. So creating personality or showing personality in a character is about consistency. So show something repeatedly and we'll understand, oh, that person's generally more of an upbeat, chatty, relaxed extrovert. But if we then see them when they're threatened behave in a completely different way, in a way that we wouldn't expect, and we see that happening a few times when they're threatened, we'll learn something about them. It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. We make and draw meaning from that, and we will often look to backstory to try and understand that. Okay, so just in summary then, I have said that complex characters have 5 personality dimensions and 30 facets of personality. We read the strongest. So you don't need to think about all 30 of these, but for each dimension, if you go back to your original list and maybe you just had 4 dimensions, 4 groups there, or 3 groups there, it could be that was because maybe you weren't thinking about a few of those dimensions. So go back and have a look at that list. Is there something here that you can take usefully away from this workshop? So some people like to think about these ideas when they're thinking about characters the first time. Other people say, absolutely not, I want to write intuitively. But the only, what I'm going to take away from this, which may be useful, is simply some of the vocabulary around this, just thinking about, when I've written a first draft or a second draft and I'm reflecting on my character, it could be useful for me to think, okay, maybe I'm missing something here. Maybe this gives me some tools to start solving some of the problems. Okay, personality shapes our behaviour, relationships, emotional experience, motivation, beliefs, and even dialogue. I'm not touching on dialogue today, but it does as well. It's really interesting. It suggests backstory. It informs tone and genre. If you're writing a more upbeat story and you have a central character that's more of an upbeat extrovert, that's really going to help set your tone. Memorable characters are memorable because they're different. Characters are often most interesting when they act out of character in ways that are believable given their backstory and the context that they're in. And the scene. Right, finished. Okay, so if you have any questions, please go ahead, and I'm going to stop my share now.
We are back in the room. Now, I'm aware that we have an extremely large group here. So we have a couple of options. I can ask you to pop your question in the chat because I'm not sure I'll see you. I can't see all of you on screen at the same time if you wave. If you have questions, we can put them in the chat. Alternatively, Kira-Anne, you mentioned earlier that there was an exercise that you would have dived into had a little more time. And I wonder, for those people who are itching to do just sort of 10 minutes of an exercise to really some of the learning, we might be able to, instead of sort of struggling with 100 people on the chat, we don't have any questions yet, although I'm checking the chat, whether we might finish with a nice little exercise.
Okay, so I would have spent more time on all of those exercises, but something else that I would do afterwards is I would have got you to think about your secondary characters and how they contrast and compare with your main characters. So obviously, characters need to be different. We're not going to make clones of the same character. That would be ridiculous. But it's also really interesting, I think, to think about how conflict comes about. So I mentioned that a character who's high on openness to experience compared with a character who's low on openness to experience are likely to get into arguments. Of course, too assertive and disagreeable characters are also like to get into arguments. So have a think about relating to those dimensions. In what ways are your characters similar and what ways are they different?
Great. So if everyone could make a note that you can maybe in your own time make that into a little exercise. Meantime, thank you. We do have some questions through the chat. I thought you were just all being shy. We've got a question here from Michael who says, I wonder how much you feel a character can move from one extreme to another in terms of personality traits.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I haven't touched on that at all today. They absolutely do. So as we grow older, we naturally become a little bit more extroverted. This is until midlife, unfortunately. A little bit more extroverted, a little bit more conscientious throughout our lives. We become more open to experience until midlife, and we become a little bit more stable. So lots of good things happen to us until our midlives. After that, we tend to become a little bit more closed to experience, a little bit more introverted. We continue to become more conscientious and a little bit neurotic. So my point there is generally most of us are growing in personality. Although personality feels as though it's stable, we are growing. Our personalities change throughout our lives. And it's changed by simply, the fact we're getting older, we're being shaped by cultural pressures, but also the emotionally intense life experiences we go through. So in terms of the degree it depends on genre. If you're writing a very realistic drama and it's set across somebody's whole life course, it may be that they go through some quite considerable change, particularly if they're going through really intense life experiences. Yes.
And so we've got another question here about character arc. So rather than we're talking about the lifespan and the kind of psychology of a personality trait changing. Can personality traits changing within a character's arc be used to support us understanding as readers their character arc?
Absolutely, absolutely that. So generally, we are. We grow, we become, we grow for the better. We develop our personalities, and everything becomes a bit better. So more outgoing, more open, etc. But of course, some people don't. So some people, I'm going to think, Walter White in Breaking Bad. I'm going to defaulting to the TV series there. Some people, as personalities, that the transformation is in the opposite direction. So we can change according to the experiences we've gone through. That's the biggest pressure on us. So if you think it feels right, then it's very possible. That is certainly part of the character arc, personality transformation.
This links to another question we've had here about, for example, moving from that neurotic trait in the beginning and becoming bolder and more emotionally stable to bring a sort of resolution to the narrative of the story. Does that would still feel sort of believable and doable?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. Again, the degree to which it needs to feel plausible, and it depends on the genre again. But if it's a drama, it's supposed to feel realistic. Then we would expect a character that it's absolutely fine that they become more stable over time.
And we've got another question here about the writing of a character who suppresses elements of their personality. So if we know as a writer that our character fits within a particular trait, but they're trying to appear otherwise, how might we that? I think that's quite a tricky question, but from your point of view, is there a way to navigate that?
Fascinating. So two things occur to me immediately. One is that they may be being devious. They may be suppressing elements of their personality because they're devious, and they're trying to act like somebody that's more agreeable, more pleasant for social advantage according to the situation. So the interesting thing is to show them suppressing the personality in situations they need and then also revealing those darker elements of their personality. Other characters, of course, will, according to cultural and social expectations, suppress elements of the personality because they're very conscientious. They're aware this doesn't fit within their culture or the social environment they're in, and they'll suppress them for those reasons. So I think the fascinating thing about that is showing them suppress them in some situations and reveal them in others.
So I suppose what you're saying is, in order for us to help our characters deviate from personality traits, actually we need a fundamental understanding of what those truest traits are, even if they're not revealed fully to the reader.
Absolutely, that's what I would suggest. Yeah.
Brilliant. And so this, just to remind people as well, this does, Dr. Kira-Anne Pelican has also written a book, The Science of Writing Characters. This draws on research that she's done into this and gathers that all together from a writing perspective. So you've got the link, we've added the link on the portal page. You will see a bookshop.org link at the bottom where the Writers Forum is, and you can see books by all of our speakers, so you can have a look there. And the book, does that contain sort of ways to put that into practice? How far is it sort of theory, and how far does it relate to actually applying it to your writing practice?
I probably it's about half and half. So I use examples to illustrate everything. I think that's really important to do. Yes.
Brilliant. And I suppose we are just about to. Well, actually, no. We've got 5 minutes, so we're fine. Let's have a look. We have that was about suppressing character traits. Oh, so well, this is quite a theoretical question, or a philosophical one, maybe. Why do you think the most memorable characters, in terms of their personality, tend to be deeply flawed, if even that is true?
So flaw is something really interesting. I think that flaws must be culturally determined. We have because from a psychological perspective, unless it relates to mental health, then everything goes. We can be all of these different things, but of course some aspects of our personality are valued more by some cultures than others. So I suspect that flaws are culturally determined, and that may be that it's not great to be neurotic, that it's not great to be more of an introvert. Why not? And we tend to show growth against that. And generally, the way that we grow is shaped by our culture. So it's not surprising that most characters, when they heal those flaws, they become more they fit better in with cultural expectations. So why is it the most memorable characters are deeply flawed? I think that's possibly because we identify with those characters as well. If they're very, very deeply flawed, any extremes are going to be more memorable because we see them less. So it comes back to the outlier things. A deep flaw is simply an aspect of the personality that you're showing strongly, and the stronger you show it, the more that an outlier is, so we'll remember them. So I think that's the answer.
Oh, that's what a general writing rule anyway, isn't it? That you always need to balance that horrible mix of kind of subtlety on the one hand, and on the other hand, making it slightly more obvious than you think, or making coincidences happen in a way that they might not in real life. You've just mentioned there actually something around cultural shapers of personality traits. And one of these is relevant to this question we've had here. It's from writer Jamie, who's working on a story about a character who's neurotypical with an undiagnosed syndrome. And I suppose the same could be said of neurodiverse characters. How do you deal with A, undiagnosed syndromes, and B, I suppose in the same vein, neurodiversity when it comes to personality traits, when this feels slightly more complicated?
Yes, I would say I don't have a quick answer for that here, unfortunately. That would be if you want to contact me after the session, I can talk to you about that, but I don't have a rapid answer for that.
Sure, that's absolutely fine, but presumably just a less stable way of looking at it, but also pretty important to look at it with more sensitivity as well, or with a deeper sense of sensitivity. So, somebody's just made a comment, but I think it's worth us looking at. Cora has said flaws also come from personal wounding in backstory. So this could also be a question about, I suppose, even when you're writing, for instance, memoir or kind of autofiction, and we're thinking about trauma, and even in fiction, when we're thinking about trauma shaping personality traits, how do we deal with that? Because that might be something that isn't necessarily inherent to them, but that has happened as a result of something happening to them that's molded their personality.
Absolutely. How do we deal with that? So if it's something traumatic that they've gone through, that can shape us in different ways. A third of the people going through trauma will unfortunately develop post-traumatic stress disorder and continue to be haunted by the event, depression, anxiety, nightmares, and so on. Some people thrive after trauma. They tend to be the people, that fewer people. Post-traumatic growth, they tend to be people with more stable backstories, and also they're resilient and have a very good social support network around them. Those people come away and find life more meaningful every day. So I think it depends on how that person has gone through it. If we're saying a flaw has arisen, if we're saying that the flaw is that they're now defensive, difficult, depressed, then they're most likely to be healed by therapy. Having a good social support network is going to take time.
But that's also, especially if you're writing fiction, I suppose it's all the more reason to really interrogate those personality traits in the context of a character's backstory, as you were saying, that those really do exist in parallel, and that helps us as writers understand what your character's response will be that feels believable to their personality, to how they are, their kind of their personality makeup almost.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Okay. We are coming to the end of this session. I can't see any additional questions, but we do have, I should say, Kira-Anne, lots of thank you so much messages from people who found this really fantastic and helpful as a new way of approaching how to write character, but also how to understand character on a much deeper level. I think we can be in a rush to kind of write something and not really dig deep. So this has been really, really helpful and interesting.
Thank you so much, everybody. It's been lovely to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
And thank you, all of you, all 100 of you here. And I'm sorry we can't hear from everybody, but in this larger group, I do hope that you can understand why. Do remember that you've got both the portal and also we've emailed you the links to your next session. The next session is a breakout group starting at 5 minutes past. So you do have a 5-minute comfort break now. Please take your break, stretch, get a glass of water, a cup of tea, and then use the portal to log into your next session. And a reminder of your links to your specific breakout groups are on email as well, just in case you have any issues. Thank you very much, Kira-Anne, and we will see all of the rest of you in 5 minutes for your next session.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.